Yay, that worked perfectly. Hi, Dan.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you fantastically. And I want to just tell you a little bit about why I invited Dan to Department of Dreams, why we did as a team. I mean, other than the fact that I'm consistently inspired by Dan's work over the years, at the beginning of the COVID-19 lockdown, Dan started to release a set of papers that were just really beautiful, bite-sized reflections on different things. I do remember thinking at that time, I have no idea how he's managing to get this all down because I was still figuring out. Well, I don't even know, but they were so beautiful and they made me think and I feel like things were moving so quickly during this lockdown period that they were there in a moment of time and I didn't even have time to reflect on them. So I wanted this us to talk about it again because of course as we've learned from the last few days there's so many different things going on and we need to be able to take lots and lots of different types of thinking and reflection and information and weave it together, and that's definitely been the case during this festival. So I hope that you will enjoy this morning and just have time to sort of sit back and listen to Dan's reflections, because I know for me just the way his mind works makes me think about things in extremely different ways. So the session is called From Lockdown to Slowdown. Dan's going to talk through how some of the 2020's extraordinary current events are part of much broader, deeper movements, both positive and negative, around climate, culture, politics, health, places, and social justice, and how we might think about them and act upon them. In terms of sorting through the implications of new patterns of living, in particular, he'll be looking at how streets become a fulcrum for all these things and the potential in the street itself as a place to rebuild around. Now, this is really exciting, and we're not going to make too much of a noise about it this weekend because we're going to be doing this in the Department of Dreams over the summer, but we're going to be doing a streetscape redesign project, of which a few of the speakers who you've heard from this week are going to be involved in that, and it's going to be based in the neighborhood we're based in and with lots and lots of people that we work with. And we'll be inviting lots of you to that. So if this whets your appetite in any way and you're interested in that, make sure you just let us know in the chat so we can get your name down. So Dan's the strategic director of design at Vinnova, the Swedish government's innovation agency. You can find him on Twitter as City of Sound, and the Slowdown papers will be in the event chat shortly. On that note, I'm going to hand over to you, Dan. I'm just going to
hmm
slip into the backstage and I will see you shortly for a
All right.
conversation.
Can you see my screen okay, I guess?
Yeah, we can see
Brilliant.
everything.
All right. So thank you, Imi, and it's so nice to be invited to this, and it's such an amazing event. So it's a great privilege for me to be able to do this. I'm standing in Stockholm, Sweden, but you can tell I'm British originally. Probably I grew up in Sheffield and moved all over the world many times. And it's particularly nice to be able to speak in a British city or around a British city, but from this very strangely dislocated international sort of way. But I'm a big believer in the work that you're doing there, so it's incredibly nice to be able to speak. So thanks for asking. And so I'm going to talk about this thing, Slowdown Papers, which I don't know how I wrote it either. In answer to your kind of pointed question. I started writing it, as you'll see, a while before it happened, but it just felt like a way for me to understand what was going on. I either pull that into the work directly, or I pull it into writing around the work, and then the work responds to that, and vice versa. So it's just a natural way of doing it for me. There's a few more papers to come, actually, which I'm working on. So a month or two later, so we'll see how that goes. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about that and some of the ideas within it. Bearing that in mind, this isn't something I'm used to talking about, to be honest, because I just wrote it. And so I hadn't really figured out how to speak about it. And writing is very different to speaking. So let's just see how this goes. But just to get something out of the way right away, as Imi said, I work for the Swedish government. I work in the innovation agency here. But this speech is not from the Swedish government, of course, it's from me. And so some of the things I'll say do absolutely relate to some of our work, and I'll describe that in detail. particularly stuff about streets and so on and related things, but other things don't. So this is from me, really. And the context of my work is very much this understanding of how do we do work at this point, right? By which I mean particularly governance and decision making. And I use decision making more broadly because I don't want to imply this is something that is just done by government to people. But this quote from Madeleine Albright is really key for me, that we still haven't changed the way that we make decisions collectively. We're still in some way using 1900s or 1800s kinds of ideas and tools, as you know. A lot of the governance boundaries, the way that Birmingham or Britain is, or Europe or Africa is made up, are entirely based on arbitrary and sometimes deeply problematic subdivisions, with very different ideas in mind to some of them that are around now. So we have a lot of work to do around this rethinking the machinery, and it means that policy making is completely different. So most of my day job is spent dealing with how do we turn this kind of environment. This is England and Spain negotiating something at about 1603 or 1604, I think, after one of their many wars at the time. Basically, a bunch of experts or people in power in a room writing a document together. It's exactly the same now, I can say, and often people look exactly the same. I'm speaking as a white bearded man looking at a bunch of white bearded men. So have things changed? And it is effectively a bunch of experts in a room. Now they're writing a Word document together, which is probably even worse than actually writing on paper with a quill, but anyway. But it hasn't changed in practice that much, and that's 400 years later. So we're looking a lot about how do we change that? And so a lot of my work is then to do with, well, understanding that these things are not technical issues. You can't just follow the science. I think as David Runciman pointed out in the context of the virus, as soon as the science becomes to do with this, with human behavior, then it's intrinsically political. So these aren't technical or scientific approaches you can put down. As much as I believe in, Greta Thunberg might say in terms of what do other scientists say, that's absolutely true, of course, in terms of the context of climate change. But then what? And what does that actually translate into? And there's a huge gap there around culture and identity and economics and social fabric and ethics, as we know. So then COVID sort of put all of this on the table very quickly indeed. And then to some extent, I think of COVID as kind of an accelerant of the things that were happening anyway to some degree, but good and bad. And obviously, I don't want to say it's a good accelerant. You don't want to use COVID as an opportunity. I really don't like the language of let's not waste this crisis and stuff like that. It's, there are so many people dying that it seems entirely inappropriate to talk about any sense of opportunity or even silver lining or anything. Having said that, it provides a way of looking at things that were happening anyway, because it speeds things up. And that's partly what the Slowdown Papers was about observing and reflecting and understanding what was going on. So that's all I'm going to claim with this talk, if that. I started writing it, though, earlier, before there was any talk of COVID. I started writing these pieces around Christmas time or January, early January, when Australia, where I used to live, and we have family there, was pretty much clouded by bushfire smoke across the entire eastern seaboard. So there's this kind of interesting sort of thing about people wearing masks across both of these situations, which made it very clear and easy to draw the link. And the air pollution, obviously, in the bushfire case was in many respects possibly more dangerous than COVID in lots of ways. Sydney and Melbourne and Canberra had the worst air quality in the world for a few weeks there. And it was a continental scale climate event. I thought, wow, if 2020 delivers one thing, this is it, and then little did I know, but it felt massive at the time, and now barely people even think about it. And so part of what I was doing was looking at this kind of, again, climate event on a massive continental scale. I mean, the smoke reached to Argentina from Australia, which if you've seen the Pacific Ocean on a map, it's quite a long way. And yet I also could sense that people might just forget this and move on. So part of this idea of writing the Slowdown Papers was about what I call writing it to memory in a sort of technical illusion, but writing it down in order to remember. And I'd done that previously in another climate event when I was in Brisbane in 2011, when there were these floods, which basically took half the city and covered it in water. And I thought, okay, this is going to change the way the city completely thinks about what it's doing in terms of its pattern of development. This is a picture I took near where my mother-in-law's house is. I mean, the suburb just disappears underwater. That's not a river, that's a street, right? So, and yet within about 2 weeks of the floodwaters receding, after people had died and, billions of dollars, I mean, we're talking about 30, 40 billion dollars worth of Australian dollars worth of damage there. The city sort of snapped back to where it was and started building back down by the river. And I'd argue things haven't really changed much at all in terms of the perception of climate. I mean, after this, you see the current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, this is before he was Prime Minister, when I think he was Chancellor of the Exchequer or the equivalent, the Finance Minister, holding up a lump of coal in the Australian Parliament and saying this is nothing to be afraid of. This is what Australia is made of, and this is where our economy comes from. And this man is now the Prime Minister of Australia. So going from that to that is kind of extraordinary, the inability to react to what's going on. And of course, COVID is a climate event. It's entirely to do with the way that we have built the world around us as humans, that it comes from our patterns of development. It's not something that nature is doing to us, it's the other way around. And it's exploited the patterns of global trade that we have built, and it's exploited the fact that we're deforesting jungles and so on. So it's entirely created by us. So it's exactly an analogy for the climate crisis. In fact, it's part of the same crisis. It's just a faster moving part of it. So I started looking at then the relationship between the sort of graphs that people started making quite quickly, this language of flattening the curve, which you all know, keeping that kind of red line down and spreading out the impact and the effort required to keep it within the capacity of our healthcare systems. And I started thinking about, well, actually, given that there's this massive overlap, that some of the measures taken for COVID, like locking down, not moving, not flying, not going into the city centre, but working from home, some of those things might be entirely necessary to do also to deal with the climate crisis. So is there an overlap? I mean, there is an overlap between the actions taken to keep the curve of corona down and the same actions required to do climate. Of course, there are many other things that we need to do to solve the climate crisis, which again is a far bigger issue than corona. Corona is just like a footnote in the greater climate crisis, to be honest. In time, I think we'll see that. And there are many, many more things we need to do to solve climate, but there's a huge overlap with the type of things to do with corona. What we need to do is not be reactive about it and have a gun put to our head and say, okay, now do it. We need to do this progressively with a just transition and carefully and strategically, like on purpose, in other words. Otherwise, as we've seen, it entirely runs along the fault lines of social inequality that are in place right now. And again, it flourishes in those gaps. So we can see that if you're British and South Asian background ethnically, then you're more likely to suffer from corona. You can see in places like Kansas, you're 7 times more likely to die than a white person if you're African American. So those things are things that we don't want to have happen with the climate crisis, I would say. So I started looking at these graphs and saying, okay, the big red thing is what we want to avoid with climate. That's global temperature going up past 3 degrees. That's going to be extraordinarily painful and destructive and horrific. So let's keep it in this green space down the bottom. We need to flatten things accordingly. Interestingly, you started seeing changes straight away. I mean, we probably all remember this now. It also feels a little bit like 4 years ago, but it was only back in March when you could see immediately air pollution dropping in China, just as a result of switching off polluting machinery, factories and cars and so on. You started seeing the waters in Venice clear. I used to live near Venice, and you never saw this kind of clarity of water, to be honest. It was just impossible to imagine. So again, can you sort of see before Corona, we had this amount of cars driving around the city on the left-hand side of the graph there. And maybe through Corona, they fall down, and they do to some extent, of course. Let's say they're half the amount of movement going on. Then there's the question, what do we want it to go back up to? What do we need it to go back up to? We don't want it to go back up to where it was before, to be honest, in terms of polluting car traffic because of those previous images. And what could you do if you started taking the mix of transport on the left-hand side of this graph before Corona, where you have, let's say, 50% cars, 50% other stuff, and actually through the Corona curves, and multiple curves, I imagine, in multiple places, really shift that pattern. Now, we've seen that happening, which is very positive since, which is what I'm going to be writing about next. But you can also see cars bumping back up in lots of places. Transit, which gets a bad rep, actually, it turns out, because it doesn't seem to be so far a super spreader at all. In many places has crashed through the floor. So that's public transport, I mean. Which means that you could start thinking about, again, so what is the street about before, largely dominated by vehicles, afterwards, let's say, largely dominated by biodiversity and walking, and still with place where commerce and culture are the things that streets are about, and vehicles then become a footnote in what the street is about. If you do that kind of thing, all kinds of interesting things happen. There's a lot of research showing that birdsong is almost inversely proportional to traffic, that birds have to start screaming louder basically to find a mate. Once the traffic noise goes up, once traffic noise drops, they can sing again. So you sort of have all these interesting outcomes. I'm not claiming that we do this all to increase birdsong, nice as that would be, but there are many, many, many other things obviously that come from reducing the traffic. Aviation, we know, as kind of through Corona, has been flattened to the floor immediately. There's a question, in my mind at least, about what it should go back to. What does it need to go back to? Given that it was very polluting and increasingly polluting, not going down actually, should it just switch back on and go back up to where it was? I'd argue no, but that's something we need to make an active decision about. And we haven't made an active decision about this. Of course, in a pandemic, you just stop flying. You just, that's an easy decision to make. It's not a decision made on purpose. It's the pandemic has forced us into the decision. But the decision after, or as we begin to unlock, that's a decision, an active decision. It shouldn't just go up to what it was before, in many people's minds. Construction is the same, the amount of food, homegrown versus imported. These are all things we could make active decisions about at this point. So I started looking at then, how do we use this time and understand it across a series of different scales? And after I wrote the Slowdown papers, I discovered this book called Slowdown, which came out about 5 days after I published. So it's sort of interesting. And Danny Dorling and I have been talking a little bit since, but he's a geographer or demographer really at Oxford University, and he wrote this book Slowdown, which I genuinely recommend to everybody. He's written it over the last few years, obviously, because it just came out. He might want to produce an appendix now, but or maybe I was inadvertently writing a weird appendix to his book without knowing it. It's not as good as his book, but anyway, he talks about how actually we've been slowing down for a long time. This idea that things have been speeding up and accelerating and there's constant turmoil and change, absolutely nonsense. He talks about data point after data point, GDP growth, population growth, life expectancy, everything just flattening off. The growth of Chinese cities, all of those things are slowing down. They're not speeding up. The change in the change is slowing down in all of them. Population increase globally is not going to be the 12 billion or 11 billion that it was posited even a couple of years ago. Even the UN geographers don't really adjusted their numbers yet. But things are slowing down and have been for 30, 40 years at least in many places. He argues that could be immensely positive in lots of ways. It will also be problematic in other ways. But he has graph after graph, whether it's world population, population of India. Japan obviously is kind of a forerunner of this kind of thing, where you've seen this kind of slowdown happening for many years now. But interestingly, he points out, if you look at Japan in 1970, exactly the same number of young people there, and proportionally, as there are in India now. So the Indian population, in terms of its demographics, was as Japan was in 1970. So we're in that kind of slowdown, even in places like India, which we're seeing are growing fast. So this really shakes your idea about what is common sense. And in Thomas Piketty's new book, he talks about ideology, which is a way of saying what's common sense. Your ideology is radical, or mine is common sense. Mine is radical, yours is common sense. These are entirely based on what we think is a plausible idea. He calls an a priori plausible idea, as in an idea that we understand to be true before we've really thought about it or seen the data to suggest it, of what we think will happen. That's what's being shaken now, and that's what you can think of as this language called the Overton window. What's a possible thing to do from a policy perspective right now? Some things were unthinkable, like people used to smoke in aeroplanes, totally normal at one point. Now just seems utterly absurd. People used to drive cars without seatbelts, totally normal. Now it's just unbelievably risky and selfish, so dangerous. You wouldn't do that. So these things come in and go out of the window. Basically the window is open now, and ideas are being shoved into it. Some will fall back out, some will be thrown out, but some might stick. So then I took this idea for a walk a bit in the second set of papers I wrote, saying, okay, let's just look at a few different scales of this. And this is where I use a principle that the Finnish architect Eliel Saarinen talked about 100 years ago. Always design in this next bigger context. And so you start thinking about, well, how does home life change around this? Living, working, gardening, living in and around and working with your family or with friends or by yourself or whatever. There are various interesting models of architecture around that kind of repurposed environment. Again, real forerunner. Sarah Wrigglesworth worked with Jeremy Till, her partner, building this amazing house in North London or Central London almost. Is really worth looking at, again, in this light as a place to do living and working and growing all in the same space. It's not actually big or it's not expensive, actually. It looks beautiful, clearly, but it's just well done. That's definitely worth looking at. I think I also wrote a lot about a kind of feminist unpacking of home and amazing work by Matrix, a cooperative in the mid-80s, looking at the way that the home had been balanced living and working for many years, but along gender lines, almost exclusively in the British context this is. You can look at social housing built around biodiversity, built around places you'd actually want to live and work in. This is social housing in Vienna. So this is council house in English terms. And then even types of technology. I worked on this project, Punkt, which was a cell phone, not a smartphone. It's deliberately designed to sort of switch off and disconnect. We need to sort of think about these spaces and technologies in that sense. All of these things are around us. So we need to think about how does that get revamped based on us having different working and living patterns? Because these things, I think, will persist. As I said, some will stay in the window, some will get thrown out. But the idea that we might all just go back to normal seems kind of absurd and also counter what a lot of people seem to want based on surveys. So immediately you could start seeing traffic changing. This is the week before the lockdown in London and then in British cities. So you'd see Birmingham at the top there. But you sort of started seeing people tailing off, moving into the city centres, even before the Prime Minister announced any kind of lockdown at all. And that's, it's been well known for many years that commuting is probably the least favorite thing we do. This is work by Daniel Kahneman, based on researching women in Texas, I think in the mid-90s, I seem to remember. Popular things, the most favorite things at the top, intimate relations is a lovely euphemistic phrase. You can maybe guess what that is. And then down the bottom, evening commute, particularly the morning commute, are horrifying. So people do not like to do this kind of thing. Why would you spend an hour in a car or public transport every day? And it's roughly an hour on average across Western economies just to get into an office that and sit in and go. I mean, it's not really designed on purpose as a desirable thing to do. And so given the chance, we might say, yeah, okay, I understand there's a need for an office or places to work in for sure. A lot of my work has been to do with those sort of spaces, but maybe 3 days a week and then 2 days a week I work from somewhere else, which could be home if that's plausible or possible. It's not for many people. So maybe it's a co-working space or a library or an impact hub. It could be any one of those things, but it really begins to think about your neighborhood again in a very different way. And you start thinking, again, is this a graph that we could draw? Beforehand, the city center, very dominant as an idea. Afterwards, why would we do that? Couldn't we have multiple neighborhoods? You might have one or two centers, but actually we don't need that anymore. It's a very old-fashioned way of thinking. Neighborhoods are super interesting, and you could build those up, and you end up with a very different pattern of city. And this is where I started thinking about, there's a classic piece by Cedric Price called A City as an Egg, where he talked about the evolution from this kind of boiled egg on the left-hand side, ancient city, to the fried egg of the 19th century, to the modern city described as the scrambled egg of sort of just like formless sort of messiness everywhere. And I said, well, maybe actually it's better off as an omelette, which is this, like, let's say the red pepper one down the bottom of my scribbles, sort of intense locations of flavor within this kind of albumen of connectivity. That's really kind of an interesting and diverse possibility there. You have much more possibility in terms of what a place can be about. And so you shift away from this centralized idea, the big dot on the left that everybody heads for, through to this pattern on the right, and these kind of what you might call technically polynodal, but it just means lots of different neighborhoods. So instead of this one single thing, the hub and spoke, where everybody heads into the middle of Birmingham or Manhattan or London or Paris, you actually end up with this much more complex patterned thing on the right. Far more interesting, far more equitable, actually, potentially, far more diverse, much lower carbon. You aren't moving around as much and so on. there's a precedent for this. Aldo van Eyck's plan for playgrounds in after World War II in Amsterdam is a lovely model for, instead of building one huge park, one huge playground, he designed over 700. This is only a map I could make of the known sort of 40 or 50 remaining, because they've all faded over the years, over the last 80 years or so. But he built them in bomb sites, and he built them in neighborhoods or on street corners. And there were these amazing kits that you could distribute out across the place and start softening and introducing play into places around the city instead of pulling everybody to a centralized location. I mean, every street became a playground in that sense. And of course, it healed the scars of the city in a really meaningful way. And it was super modular and extensible and so on. So we've taken that principle into what we're doing in Sweden now, where we have a mission to transform every street in this way in the country to be healthy, sustainable, and vibrant. This is a street in Stockholm. And we're looking at, why would you do that? Well, of course, lots of reasons why. Decreased carbon, improved air quality, it would improve the retail spend and so on. But also, if you start greening the street in this way and start multiplying the diversity of possibilities on the street, you increase safety, you decrease domestic violence, actually, you can increase social fabric, you can decrease crime. All of those things come around the same types of interventions here. So this is actually a street in Copenhagen, but forgive me. But you can start seeing these are a system of impacts that come down to particular interventions in the street. We're working actually with, I know Indy, my great friend and colleague Indy Johar spoke yesterday. We're working with Indy a lot on these principles, building on their trees as infrastructure work and many other things. So this comes down to then designing this through as a kit of parts. And we started building what we call these kind of system in the room workshops around these kinds of things, pulling in multiple people together, public, private, small, third sector, private sector, public sector. In the one on the right, actually, there are school kids as well. So they're part of the process of feeding in alongside the CEOs of mobility companies and the Architecture Design Institute and so on. And we're getting them to scribble on bits of paper, and they come out with these kinds of interventions. These are things I tidied up to make them look a bit nicer afterwards, but they start producing a sense of how we would transform the street iteratively. I've got a lot of separate thinking about that. And this is where we are now. These are very early sketches of, okay, how would you build these components, which are known elsewhere in the world as parklets? This is no great innovation in terms of an idea. It's been done for many years. I think I did my first parking day back in 2008 in Sydney. But the difference now being is this is like a tactical and urbanism intervention, but we're doing it strategically as the government. So it's not being instigated as an exception to the rule. We're trying to work with exactly the same fabric and work with communities on the ground in a way that doesn't ever usually happen at the national government level, to help them co-design what these things are about. But we basically make it happen strategically as the government. We can change the rules around parking spaces, for instance, if we need to do that, if we decide to do that. That's something you can't do from a tactical approach. You sort of have to go around the parking space, and therefore it's difficult to lock it in and genuinely change. Just as that work in Amsterdam I showed you after the war was commissioned by the Amsterdam City Council. So a beautiful piece of architecture, but totally commissioned through the public program. So it locks in strategically and it happens at scale, 700 playgrounds, right? So we need to make a pattern that can build this across the country. That requires a certain amount of institutional redesign and to use the language of tactical urbanism, and use the techniques of it. So that, again, the citizens, they decide what happens on the street, and it's actually their kit of parts, but it's set up by us so that it can lock in strategically. And again, you can change the institution based around those particular places and people. So this is a kind of an urban boardwalk that's developing. Right now, the context of this is intensely political, because as you know, there are so many things around the world happening a bit like this. Post-COVID street renovations popping up: Berlin, Auckland, Seattle, places you never thought would happen. This is like in the last 6 to 8 weeks. Again, we've been working on this for about 6 to 8 months and trying to do it a bit more strategically, perhaps, but we're now also looking at the same opportunity to accelerate what's happening there, I guess. But there's a danger in how you do this. Again, and if you don't do this right, you get this. This was an amazing post to Instagram kind of a week or so ago, I think. 2 weeks ago, which shows a bunch of white folk basically having brunch in the foreground whilst the Black Lives Matter protest walks past in the background. So in the same street, and this street is then changed in an interesting way, you have different types of politics happening simultaneously here. And there's absolutely a danger of, as I put it in this kind of thing here, is the parklet is built for brunch. And meanwhile, Black Lives Matter has to sort of move back in the background. That's entirely the wrong way around, it seems to me. The street is about protest and politics as much as anything else. It also can be about brunch and birds, right? But it's just the process that happens with the way and how open that's done is massively important. It's the whole point, in fact. The previous generation of problems come from traffic engineering deciding what the street is about in a very top-down way. And it leads to massive inequalities. I mean, they are built largely for power structures that are in place, as in almost all public transport. Even Oslo shows this many times over in their research, but numerous cities do. Public transport even is built around men getting to and from work. And we know that Black communities absolutely are on the wrong end of the wedge there when it comes to the care and attention given to what street environments can be. So there's a danger of this sense of optimization, and particularly if you have a certain kind of culture behind it. I looked at Y Combinator, their New Cities initiative. Of course, you get many tech companies. This is a VC company looking at cities now and saying, what do we optimize for? What are those KPIs? Completely the wrong language. I mean, streets are not about optimizing as such, and many things that make a wonderful street are entirely inefficient. Kids playing football and people sharing drinks, or sort of spilling out into the street, or having a protest. These are things that aren't about efficiency at all. So you can't optimize. And there's a danger with that. And I sort of talked just briefly about technology, and the understanding of tech is really misunderstood by a lot of people, including in tech. This is the different analogy, but I write about this in the piece. The Bill Gates Foundation funded, or Bill and Melinda Gates, I should say, Foundation Toilet of the Future project, which is, to be clear, is a fantastic thing. I don't mean to diss it in any way, but nonetheless, they poured hundreds of millions of dollars into this thing called an omniprocessor, which transforms dirty sewage water into drinking water. So it's a fantastic thing. But equally, the landscape architect Julia Watson just wrote a lovely book called Low Tech about the East Kolkata wetlands, which is also technology, as in humans made it to do something. And it's an extraordinary system on the edge of Kolkata. And it also transforms sewage into stuff. But if you look at the performance here, if I get briefly performative about it, the one on the left costs millions of dollars. It does 14 tons of sewage a day, and it gets thousands of liters of drinking water out of that. That's pretty good. But the one on the right, $0, 700 million tons of sewage a day, 13,000 tons of fish a year, 16,000 tons of rice, 156 tons of vegetables, feedstock, and so on, 80,000 jobs. And that is also technology. And which one stacks up best? But which one do you think is under threat from property development right now? So the one on the right is an extraordinary piece of tech. The one on the left isn't. And it's this danger of giving the wrong kind of culture of the decision-making here, which is very problematic. So the one on the left, the omniprocessor is installed in Dakar now, and that's a good thing. Like I said, that is not a bad thing at all. It's just that let's not lose the sense of the one on the right, and perhaps there's more value in that one, the East Kolkata wetlands. So simultaneously to the street being looked at for kind of renovation post-COVID, Black Lives Matter, you start getting all these kinds of other interesting things. People, again, pre-COVID, pre the street, looking at marking bits of biodiversity. And there are a lovely movement that sprung up in and around Europe, including in the UK. In the UK, awkwardly, it was deemed illegal. You're not allowed to do this for absurd reasons, which again shows that we need to change the law, change the institution, change the way that we run these things based on what real people want to do. Equally, you could see these extraordinary things, this one in Washington, as you know, this one in Seattle. Entirely, this is just showing again what the street can be about, what the street arguably should be about, in my view. This is in Stockholm. I took this last week. This is in a bit of suburban Stockholm on a bike path, and it's kind of just extraordinary, the change there. So the way that we're doing it is important. So back to our street project. This is where I'm interested to hear Tim's talk next, where we're designing this with kids. So this is kids using little bits of paper and gluing together what they think should happen on the street. We actually also did this with the Prime Minister. That's the Prime Minister of Sweden on the left. That's the Health Minister in green next to him. I won't say who was best at this, but certainly this is what the kids come up with, and they come up with amazing things like fake palms and fountains and cafes and gyms and so on, also little parliament spaces and stuff. And that's what we're now building out in the streets. This is building in Stockholm, outside a couple of schools here. In September, we'll have a few schools running, and then we built this logic to scale across the country. So again, what's really crucial to me is that it's not really about the goal of just shifting the street from one mode to another. It's actually opening up the process by which this happens. And Nikita Oliver sort of inadvertently put this in almost the language of an urban design brief, as they sort of speaking as someone that writes those things occasionally. So, you know, it's taking the street for a protest can happen as an exception, just as the parklet movement can exploit parking space laws in that way. But to turn it into a space that serves the community, that's an entirely different process. It has to be a strategic process, I'd argue. This is where Destiny Thomas wrote a fantastic piece specifically about diversity in the context of the street, and open street movements, which look on the surface to be broadly just a good thing by definition, unless you change the process behind it, will, as I put it in a piece I wrote for Disegno recently, just optimize for brunch. And that will not change what things are about. So this is something I wrote for Disegno about that. Both the kind of scribbles that kids are doing on the street about trees and plants and the movement for that, and Black Lives Matter, making it into epic street art. They're both political acts, and they're about making the street a place to make a mark. The way that we do that is fundamentally important. So I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit now, just to give us a bit of time to talk. So I'll race through this if you don't mind, but building on the back of the Aldo van Eyck idea, you can see programs around markets. These are street markets in Rotterdam being repurposed or proposed to be repurposed more at the neighborhood scale and distributed. And it's built around social distancing, which I think will go fairly soon. Lots of reasons why, partly not least because humanity is about basically crowds, and the lovely quote from Baudelaire. It's also about solitude, of course, but enjoying the crowd, taking a bath of multitude is what we're about. So I think actually the most interesting thing in this Rotterdam market is not that it's the social distancing stuff, it's the shift from the big centralized markets on the left to this pattern of distributed things on the right. So overlaying Aldo van Eyck and the Rotterdam markets, you get these kinds of patterns. This is really close to what a lot of cities are doing anyway. As Paris have this plan again, a little bit like we have been working strategically for a while. Paris is way ahead now in terms of this lovely idea of the 15-minute city built around proximity, participation, collaboration, and ecology. So you see these kinds of things, all of your needs within 15 minutes, biking and walking, your daily needs, that is. And then you have metro, like tying the whole thing together. So again, the process by which we do this is fundamentally important, but the outcome, I think we can understand. And that builds on the idea of going way back, Jane Jacobs' idea of a city being a living network of relationships. And I'll come back to that one. And there's a more deeper understanding of what then biodiversity, the role that plays, that understanding that, okay, when we talk about relationships, even Jacobs in her quote talks about a network of human relationships, actually understanding that it's multi-species relationships, that we're part of this system. These are amazing living bridges. In a funny way, actually, Wakanda in the film Black Panther is possibly the most interesting vision around at the moment. This super high-tech, low-tech, in Julia Watson's words, super green and urban at the same time. And then another understanding of technology comes in this from an Australia story, brief story in Australia. After the bushfires in Budgebim in Victoria, the bushfires burnt off some vegetation on the topsoil, and they revealed an indigenous Australian eel farm that had been lying there for 6,000 years. And as the vegetation burnt off, because this was the biggest fire for centuries probably, and then it rained afterwards, the thing just started working again. This was designed by indigenous Australians 6,000 years ago, and the water started flowing through, and the traps started catching eels. I mean, it's an extraordinary piece of technology, right? I mean, once Zuckerberg or Elon Musk come up with anything this good, I'll start listening to them. Once they think of an operating system that lasts 6,000 years, then they have my attention. Until then, they can get lost. Anyway, so another thing we're looking at then is how do you then fold in these other systems. In this case, this is another mission we have in Sweden around school food, using school food, not just to get kids to eat good food. This is roughly 50% of all the meals served every day in the country. So it's a huge lever that we can pull, but actually to produce different types of neighborhoods and communities. And so again, we're going through this. This is all in Swedish, so I can definitely skip this stuff. And we're using, let's call it dreaming or narratives as part of that. This is a story that I wrote, which begins to describe how a school gardens and grounds can be transformed, and we get people to fill in what happens next at the bottom of this, and so on. So finally, you end up with this sense of how does this slowdown begin to shift actually what places are about? As you begin on unpacking this kind of distributed pattern, what I might call a polka dot pattern, you begin to think about then regions. And I look at then again the city not being everything, but also having towns and villages and a dispersed region throughout, which we know is a huge problem. In the UK, that leads straight to Brexit. In the US, it leads to Trump. These are the inequalities that we see all over the place now. We're seeing again with COVID highlighted. And you can look at other then groundbreaking things. This lovely fab lab built in the middle of the countryside, next to forests, next to a timber company in Minami Oguni. And in the owner of this sort of talking about planting trees so the grandchildren have something to live off. He doesn't necessarily want them to, I think he put it elsewhere, just go to Osaka and become a YouTuber. We need to give them some other possibility. And that was part of the thinking. This knife company in Sweden has been making knives in this particular place for 400 years. These things are super resilient by not growing and not moving to Stockholm. This is Fiskars in Finland. We have many equivalents of this in the UK, of course, as well. And this comes back to some deep thinking about we needn't force people to move to the big cities and try to live there. Actually, this is the problem, as we know, the UK with London being so dominant. But the data shows, this is Banerjee and Duflo, the Nobel Prize-winning economists, that people don't really want to move. People in rich countries find this so counterintuitive, they refuse to believe it, they say. But they don't really want to even move to the capital city if they can help it. They'd rather stay in the communities around them. But we push them out through economics at this point. So finally, let's just look at this question. If you think this is like about slowing down and moving back to the country and opening a fab lab, it's not necessarily about that at all. I'm just going to get this across. It's about rethinking the way that development happens, the engines that we put behind things. So Dorling says we're heading for a kind of stability there necessarily. And I'll come back to that because we have to think carefully about what that might mean, but it could be less precarious, better housing, better education. This is why it's a positive book that he writes. But just to say again, it doesn't necessarily mean small, quiet, slow, boring stuff. Tokyo, I think, is a really good example of this. Tokyo is really, this pattern I showed earlier, this polka dot pattern comes from the Tokyo metro map. That's how Tokyo works. Not one city center at all, but multiple. And the best examples of Tokyo you'll find are actually in the neighborhoods, which are quiet and small and slow. No cars on these things. Street parking is banned in Tokyo since 1958, I think. So the streets are clear for people and things like this. Street corners and so on. It works. It's super safe. You see this elsewhere. This is Barcelona. But logistics happens like this in the middle of Tokyo. This is a super high-tech and low-tech thing simultaneously. I mean, you look at the guy's belt, he's covered with bits of tech, but he's pushing a car, which should be familiar to someone from 15th century Edo. Back streets can look like this, beautiful bits of architecture tucked into things, and it's kind of rebuilding in the same place because it's stopped. It's growing, actually. It's stopped growing in a sense. And so it becomes about the small pieces. And I wrote in the papers, that's the world's biggest megacity, but the scale of it is the plant pot in a tiny bar in a back alley. This is the pattern. Again, I redrew this from Dorling's stuff. It just shows basically these graphs are complex, but they just show it's kind of stopped growing from suburbs and city center and slowing down generally. So it's just kind of rebuilding in place now. It's just sort of getting better and refining itself by rebuilding in the same plot. So that polka dot idea, actually, there's a great Japanese artist, Kusama, and she makes these incredible polka dot things. So that's an excuse to get that in. So finally, I'll close with just saying that if we start rethinking what Piketty calls these a priori plausibles, we can open up other ideas in this kind of Overton window at this point. We take away this kind of idea of GDP growth, endless population growth, the drive of big cities and so on. And to be clear, I'm not saying that big cities disappear, hence my reference to Tokyo. It's just that it's slow down and they give us a chance to rethink and build around a landscape and place built around care and relationship instead. Gautam Bhan, the great Indian writer, talks about this in the context of the Indian smart cities movement, which he talks of complete failure. And he talks instead about infrastructures of everyday dignity. So this kind of care is incredibly important. The importance of the bazaar over the mall and the shared car over the expressway. So finally, Dorling talks to us about this slowdown can give us more time to worry more about one another. In a way, the rich countries slowing down first enables the poorer countries to basically level up to that point. There's a possibility of a redistribution at least happening there by taking away this engine. Everything slows down. Housing price slow down because there's fewer people in the future than we've had in the past, essentially, in terms of the growth rate. So we can question all that our grandparents never had time to question, which is a lovely thought there, because they were in the middle of that rapid acceleration. So my final point, and I just wrote this the other day on a piece for Generation C at RISD, that when we talk about slowdown, what's incredibly important, and Dorling makes this clear when he talks about Japan, says Japan slowing down doesn't mean that everything's slowed down. In fact, the one thing that has sped up there is social progress. And they have a long way to go, let's say, in terms of what I think, for what that's worth. And I have no insight into what Japan should do. But to my mind, they have a long way to go in social progress, but that's where you can see things happening. And you can see a radical shift in the way that women work and the openness to migrants, into the way that the society has been unfolding and opening up, partly because everything else has slowed down. So I would say right now, when we can talk about slowdown, it doesn't mean that we can just stop. And actually, the biggest speeding up we need to do is around this social question. And when I say that killing, I'm talking about George Floyd, of course, but set against the largest number of COVID deaths by far in the US, particularly happening in the African American or people of color communities. Whilst it's going backwards in environmental standards and producing amongst the largest carbon emissions ever, so that's where we need to speed up. But GDP growth isn't the thing that does that. The traditional economic measures, those things not working anymore, they give us a chance to do this. Otherwise, you're trying to, as I put it here, strap a Harley-Davidson engine to a Sparrow, which is clearly not a nice image to put in your heads. That gives us the moment to think about what we're about, and it's where we can speed up because everything else is slowing down. So I've been thinking about these landscapes, and actually the thing that we shift around is then care and relationship, but for each other as people, but also multiple species and environment that we're in. That's the possibility of this moment. Thank you.
Hi, Dan.
Hello.
Thank you so much. That was well, it was as beautiful as I imagined, and mainly because we've talked before the challenges Sweden has, right? It's not like it's this perfect utopia, but the idea that you're in and doing this, so much of what over the last decade for me has been like the tactical urbanism stuff where communities are burning out when they can't break through that moment from turning something into a community project or driven by people into something more institutional. And there's so many great examples of that starting to happen as well here. And so I'm always inspired by the frame, right? Because the reason that we put this festival together is to not have all the answers. In the UK particularly, we've got so many different things, as you'll know, as to why we're not working necessarily right away from the same position. But I'm really interested to know and see what it could look like when and what we should be really sort of fighting for, and especially for those of you who are tuning in who've been here the last 3 days, there's just some really wonderful overlaps between, for example, the talk from Winnipeg Boldness Project yesterday, the talk from Araceli Camargo around urban health and urban planning, and all the contradictions that sit within that for different communities, and how we work through all of that. So I'm really excited about this. And you touched on this a little bit in your talk, but maybe you could just speak to it directly, because I think I kind of understand what you mean by slow down in the city example. But we've got a question from Catherine Willis, where she says, why are we trying to fix cities? Hasn't COVID shown us that cities as models of society are broken?
I don't think we can say a city is a broken model necessarily, because I think the cities are just, unless we say that humanity is a broken model. So I don't really want to say that, on behalf of the species. Because cities, to me, they're just an outcome of that. In a way, we can look at 10,000 years or 20,000 years of since we've been making cities as just this very slow drift in that direction. I think in some senses, humans are very social animals, and therefore we tend to congregate and so on. And over time that tends towards cities. But I think the way that we do them absolutely can be broken. But I find lots of possibility in cities. My work is about cities, and I think of amongst the best things, if I can put it so glibly, that humanity's ever made are in cities and around cities. Equally, some of the worst things are because they're an expression or a manifestation of what humans are about. So we absolutely have to change the way that we do that, and that's what I'm interested in. It's how do we shift these again, a bit more Wakanda kind of ideas here. So you can make a city which is super green, incredibly quiet and pleasurable and full of life and possibility, and actually more biodiversity than you can in the countryside because of what we've done to the countryside. So that's something that we know about the way that we do cities at their best. Equally, you can do them in a horrible way. So what we're saying now is that this isn't about cities or not, because otherwise you also end up in that, is this about the countryside and everybody moving back to the countryside and then you leave cities? I don't believe in these kind of binaries. I think we need to make a possible future for all of these places and existences and understand that they're all absolutely connected. The danger is when we talk about cities as separate to something else, like the regions and systems that support it. So I'm trying to break it down into these kind of moments or smaller pieces, if you like hence doing like neighborhoods or even a cluster of houses, in the way that might work as a place for also work and growing food. And you can talk about a pattern of that, and you can talk about that shifting. And that might be something at the scale of Tokyo, or it could be something at the scale of Solihull. It could be any point in between. We'll have to figure out how to get there. The model itself can't break any more than the model of humanity can break. So as long as you believe there's some possibility in humanity changing and its pattern of development, which is kind of what the slowdown possibilities are, a chance to rethink things because the rapid acceleration time is over, then cities are entirely full of amazingly rich possible futures, which are socially just, sustainable, and healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from a personal perspective, obviously living in Birmingham and actually having actively moved more into the city, I've seen both the best and the worst of the COVID response happening in the city, right? So like the reasons why it accelerated and why I hate it here and why the cars are like piling up outside already and people are angry and frustrated and queuing up, and the best of humanity and connection and being able to walk from one neighborhood to the other and support each other. So I think I'm definitely here in that sort of binary, like rejecting the binary, but to really understand what slow down for cities looks like is something that's really interesting to me.
And Birmingham is a good example of a city built around, the idea in the 60s of speeding everything up, literally like turning the city centre into a motorway. Yeah. I mean, it's a classic example of it. And that is what we have a chance to reverse now, to unpick all of that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really love what you talked about in terms of just thinking about different units of change. So for those of you who don't know Civic Square's work, we actively have moved backwards a few steps. And when I say backwards, I don't mean that in a regressive way. I mean from moving from the scale of the city, but now to the scale of the neighborhood, to really think about some of what Dan talked about, where it's not about making, your whole life small and that there's never going to be opportunities to see the world or to travel or to do things, but that actually could the majority of what you need most of the time be available within that sort of 20-minute neighborhood walk, cycle, and other ways of getting around if you have accessibility.
Exactly.
And so I mean, we're very much at the beginning of our work on that, but really excited to actually think how do we turn that narrative around from slow down being about all the things we're going to lose, but instead, actually all the shitty things that we're going to lose and the good stuff that we can actually, like the hour commutes that make us angry and depressed and isolated, and it costs a lot. So I'm fascinated by that, and I appreciate you talking about that, because I think it's the binaries, right? It's the binaries of of and why we put this festival on, of like of being able to say we can work at different scales of this here. Like
Yeah,
you can work at the neighborhood level, and you can think at the country level of Sweden, and you can think at the street level, and you can
they're all
think,
connected.
yeah, and they're all relevant, and it's
Mm.
really important. And that brings me on to a really I want to finish with this one question. I'm sorry for those of you who haven't had your chance to ask questions, but we've got another talk coming up which is about the city and childhood. So just keep bringing the questions through to that one. And Dan's very like accessible on Twitter and stuff, so if you've got anything particular you want him to link you to, please do. But
Please do, yeah.
yeah, and I'm going to finish with this question because it's I've watched your career in different settings, and different sort of units of change that you've worked across, and now you're at a government level, like doing it from the top. And I think that's really exciting because it means that it can be institutionalized over the long term, potentially. But Emma Bierman's asked a question, and you might know Emma. She's from Leeds. She runs a beautiful play network called Play Boxes, and is an absolute pioneer and fighter for play in cities. And her unit of change is certainly, street to street,
Mm.
neighborhood, as well as trying to influence leads in the world. And she asks this question: cities talking about inclusive growth as their strategies, and that's obviously the massive buzzword here at the moment. Is
Yeah.
growth a useful term in this context, and what might we mean by growth? And I guess I'll add to that: how do we start to challenge that as well, if it's not the right term?
Yeah, and I'd just say what kind of growth, and that's a really basic thing to say, I guess. But it's why I ended up with the comment on, and why I sort of rewritten pieces recently. What I'm writing about next is Black Lives Matter following COVID, in a sense. Obviously, it was well there before it, but again, COVID being an accelerant of things, and then the terrible killings in America have enabled this question about growth in social progress, for instance, would be an extraordinary achievement and thing to do. So absolutely, that's why I mentioned the Japan thing that Dorling also ends with. He talks about Japan's economic engine slows down, enables their social progress to move forward. So we talk about growth of biodiversity. I'm all for that, because that then levels out health and climate and so on, and it prevents pandemics happening, right? So we need to make growth in that sense. Growth in social progress, you can absolutely see. And it's just another question in the chat about Sweden being a bit insular and not so diverse. And of course, that's true on the one hand, but somewhere like Stockholm is 28%, 29% from a foreign background, one way or another. So it's relatively diverse. And there are bits of Sweden, because Swedish cities are amongst the most segregated in Europe, that are incredibly diverse. And Sweden took more migrants in from anywhere during the recent migrant movements in the 2015-16. So the challenge isn't whether we are diverse or not, because in a place, in a neighborhood, it can be more diverse than the middle of, I don't know, Harlem. But in Sweden, the challenge has been that whether it's been done in a segregated way, and that my work in the government is to try to understand how Sweden incorporates diversity and an openness to that as part of what the Nordic model is. So that was also a work in Finland 10 years ago. It's actually about diversifying inputs into something without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, without saying then, let's say what UK and US has done, by having no sense of a model whatsoever. A laissez-faire approach means you can incorporate diversity by not doing anything in government. So the government, has been, as you know, been decimated in the UK in terms of local government. So it's incredibly hard to get anything done. I've done lots of work in places like Sheffield with zero budget whatsoever for anything meaningful. Amazing people trying to get stuff done, but there's nothing there. In Sweden, we still have budgets in the public sector. You still have meaningful city governments running transport and healthcare and stuff. So I'm trying to say, how do we maintain that sense of public sphere and civic value, whilst not just then doing that on the basis that everybody's white and Swedish from the 1970s? Because that isn't the reality of what Sweden is. So how do you keep that model and introduce the diversity? That, to come back to your question, is what I think Emma could talk about in terms of growth. I think economic growth, we can't even go there as a driver anymore. It's just not going to be there. Like, that's my Harley Davidson Sparrow analogy. Trying to squeeze GDP improvements and productivity improvements out of a population globally which is beginning to slow down will not work. There's just not enough stuff to sell people to, not enough people to buy things, and we don't want to be doing that anyway from a climate point of view. So we can't use that. So this is the chance to think about, so what is growth? Biodiversity, social justice, health. Just think about climate, health, social justice. That's where we need to grow. We can't use an old economic model to achieve that. And that's a kind of not an answer, but a series of questions about what growth is, I think.
Well, absolutely. Thank you so much for that frame. I definitely know I often look to you and others for ways of reframing that question, and much appreciated. And I think I'll add to the question from Rachel, which is that whilst it might not be necessarily from a government level, there's lots of work like this happening in all sorts of ways that is testing and trying. We're one of them, but the one I'd probably point to in the UK, if you're interested, which I think, Dan, you're a trustee of, is a participatory city in Barking and Dagenham.
Barking and Dagenham, yeah.
Yeah, that's probably the one I'd point to say, look, it's not like a government deciding, hey, we're going to do this and do it with some vigor, but it's local authorities certainly in partnership, in deep partnership.
Absolutely. And that's a good example, because that is the thing. So how do you build that practice, not in opposition to local government? Yeah. How do you use that to redesign what local government is, and therefore what national government is and beyond, and see those are, again, totally connected. So let's not pretend they're not. They need to work together to achieve that. That's all.
Absolutely. Well, Dan, I just wanted to say a huge thank you. I know it's been a difficult time in your family as well, so taking this time this morning is really appreciated by us. Thank you for taking through that, for your beautiful slides and take on everything. And we look forward to doing some more work together at the neighbourhood level. And for those of you really interested in streets, we're going to be doing a bit of practical sort of work with families and residents where we're based to really just have some fun with reimagining streets, because they've already sort of gone back to normal here, and it'd be good to start thinking about how they could be different.